welcome into a new episode of Bolt Breakdowns here on the Guilty as Charged podcast. I'm Alex, as always, and I sort of wanted to make this video talking about week one of Chargers free agency. Now it's in the books from Monday to Monday, from the start of the legal tampering period to now, talking about all the moves that have went down, key signings, key departures. Well, I guess more so one key departure, but I wanted to break it all down. Sort of tell you what the contracts are, how I feel about those said contracts for the production those players got, and also put a letter grade on it, because who doesn't love letter grades except me? But I did want to, I guess, mention a couple other things as we head into week two of free agency here, right? We do kind of have the pending Austin Eckler thing, which is still, in the air per his trade request. I did make a video on that last week if you want to go watch that one over on Bolt Breakdowns. And yeah, we'll see what happens in week two of Chargers free agency. Hopefully nothing breaks like Monday morning, so then this video isn't like totally, shelved and replaced with something else. But maybe the Chargers will sign John Johnson. We'll see. In the meantime, though, let's talk about everything that happened in week one of Chargers free agency. The first contract that I want to talk about is Minnesota linebacker Eric Kendricks signing with the Chargers on a 2-year, $13.25 million deal. There's $6.75 million guaranteed. There's a $4 million cap hit in year one, $9 million in year two. And I think the most important thing about this contract, and this is something that I was irked about when I first saw it, because when you signed a 31-year-old linebacker to a 2-year deal, right, there's always kind of the potential for like a precipitous fall off. But Eric Kendricks' deal is really a 1-year contract. If you look at over the cap, if you look at kind of any resource, he has a 1-year, $4 million cap hit this year. And then in 2024, the Chargers can save $6.5 million with his release, right? So basically, the Chargers have kind of done the Eric Kendricks contract in a way where they give themselves the flexibility of, hey, this is our stopgap linebacker now. Maybe we'll need him in 2024 as well. Maybe we won't, right? So I think the flexibility portion of this contract is very interesting. And it kind of signals that the linebacker market, as we'll talk about a little later with another player, was sort of dead, right? And so for the Chargers to get Eric Kendricks at the value that they got him at, which is essentially a 1-year, $4 million deal for a guy who essentially 2 years ago is not that far removed from being like an all-pro linebacker presence and is still a very solid linebacker in my opinion now. You can't say enough about it given the state of the market right now. And, with Kendricks in particular, we'll talk about Drue Tranquill, like I said, later. It's impossible to ignore that, like, Brandon Staley, again, saw kind of the run defense weakness at the second level, particularly with the linebackers, and even at the third level with the amount of runs that we're able to get there. And, he kind of, it seems like, made this, priority to go out and go get Eric Kendricks, right? And, of course, you talk about two connections on the coaching staff. Ryan Ficken was in Minnesota for 15 years, right? Not that he like coached Eric Kendricks per se, but or directly coached him, but ultimately, like, he was there and saw Kendricks play. Jeff Howard was a defensive assistant with the Vikings, and now is the linebacker coach of the Chargers. So to me, the Jeff Howard connection really makes a lot of sense here in terms of acquiring somebody like Eric Kendricks. So I think you kind of look at Ficken, you look at Howard, and this was sort of a Staley-inspired move based on both of those guys to go get Eric Kendricks as their starting linebacker. Now, of course, Kaiser White was under contract when Brandon Staley was first hired in 2021, right? Plays out the season, goes to Philadelphia, and you sort of saw the same thing happen with Drue Tranquill. So this is really, I guess, Staley's first big swing at linebacker for a linebacker who wasn't previously on the roster. And Eric Kendricks effectively slots in as your starting Mike. Just some 2022 stats for you. He had 97 tackles, 41 run stops, an 81.1 run defense grade. I do think in terms of run defense in particular, Eric Kendricks to me is an upgrade over Drue Tranquill. So from that standpoint, this signing for a run defense that needs to be fixed by the Chargers now. It already needed to be fixed last year, but now it's at the point where if this team wants to compete for a Super Bowl, if this team wants to compete in the playoffs, they have to be able to stop the run much better than they've been able to the last 2 years under Brandon Staley. And I think Eric Kendricks at least is kind of the start of that mentality. And so, he's 31, but he's not over the hill by any means. And I don't think he will be over the hill, in the 1 or 2 years that he spends with the Chargers too. He's still playing at a really high level. And so ultimately, this is a signing where the Chargers get kind of, I don't want to say all-pro linebacker potential because I don't think he's quite at that level anymore, but you effectively get kind of like potentially 1 or 2 years of a Pro Bowl linebacker, for pennies. And that's what this free agent market unfortunately was for the linebackers, as we'll talk about later. But overall, I think the Eric Kendricks signing, honestly, when I first saw it, was not like the best, just because the first contract numbers we saw were that 2 years, $13.25 million. But looking at it now, it's kind of impossible to not like the deal. I think the Chargers get a really proven veteran run stopper here who, potentially is going to be Staley's green dot linebacker. Obviously, kind of was the green dot in Minnesota. This might depend on how the John Johnson negotiations go if the Chargers are able to acquire John Johnson, because he was obviously green dot in Staley's Los Angeles Rams defense back in 2020. So, but you're looking at Eric Kendricks, who I don't think they're going to give the green dot responsibility to Derwin James again. He may be Staley's primary signal caller when it's all said and done. And so to get a veteran linebacker who's going to kind of lead the defense and also is like a really good run defense player, it's taking advantage of the inequity in this market, in this free agency. And honestly, I think it's a really solid contract. So I gave Eric Kendricks a B+ ultimately for the signing. You could argue A-. I do think there is some kind of like downsloping potential, just the fact that like he could decline for an older player as opposed to, maybe running it back with Tranquill or, signing another younger linebacker. So there is always that potential when the linebacker in particular like hits 30 years old. But I think Eric Kendricks is going to be a really fantastic signing in this Staley defense, and maybe is the first time we've really seen again, like I said, a consistent run defense stopper in Staley's scheme. So I am excited to see kind of what that looks like, and hopefully that fixes some of the Chargers' issues at diagnosing and stopping the run at the first and second levels. But overall, I give the Kendricks deal a B+. Let's talk about Trey Pipkins, who got himself a nice deal too. I made this joke on Twitter, but it does feel weird that Trey Pipkins got 3 years, $21.75 million, and everyone is like, yeah, he deserves that. Imagine like teleporting 1 year ago, 2 years ago, and being like, oh yeah, he's a $7 million a year player. Trey Pipkins, that's what he developed into, which is crazy to say. So for exact details on the contract, Pipkins got 3 years, $21.75 million, $8.75 million of which is guaranteed. His 2024 portion of his contract becomes guaranteed, I believe, at the start of the new league year next year. And the Chargers have like a couple days to decide if they want to do that, and of course they will, because the dead cap hits if they decided to cut Trey Pipkins don't make any sense. So really, Trey Pipkins is kind of on a 3-year deal. That's a 2-year deal in 2023 and 2024. They do have an out in year 3. Hopefully, Trey Pipkins is playing at a really high enough level to the point where his year 3 cap hit is effectively like kind of a discount. So I would like to see that from Pipkins, and I do think he's going to be a really solid player, as he was this year, right? Pipkins allowed 28 pressures and 2 sacks in 2022. He's only 26 years old, right? And this is a guy who started out 4 years ago when Tom Telesco drafted him as a developmental project out of Sioux Falls. And I think it reasons that, or it stands to reason that through working with Duke Manyweather, the fact that he is still pretty young, for kind of a starting like right tackle in this league, he can get better, right? Like that's the thing that the Chargers have kind of nailed with this deal. It reminds me, I guess, a little bit. I don't remember how old Michael Davis was when they signed him to the 3-year contract a couple of years ago. But this is a very similar deal in that vein, where I think you're betting on the upside of Pipkins, and you're also betting on the current stability that he provides at the right tackle position. But he has a chance to get even better. And to me, what I said about the Chargers offensive line going into this free agency is like, yes, you can create a world in which you could move on from Trey Pipkins, and move Jamari Salyer around, figure out what you want to do at guard, right? There were a lot of options for them. If they wanted to keep Matt Filer and put him at right tackle, don't think I would do that one with how Matt Filer played this year. But there were options that the Chargers had if they really wanted to move on from Trey Pipkins. But the best version of this Chargers offensive line from right tackle to left tackle was having Trey Pipkins, Zion Johnson, Corey Linsley, Jamari Salyer in there at left guard. We'll see if that's what the Chargers actually decide to do. And then Rashawn Slater in his return at left tackle. And Trey Pipkins was a huge part of that this year. I think he only has room to really get better, and I can't believe we're talking about him as though he had like a really solid season, because he did. But not what I would have predicted at the start of the season. Right tackle was a position that we really worried about going into last year with the competition that existed between Trey Pipkins and Storm Norton at one point. But Trey Pipkins put all of that to rest. He's a really solid young player, and I think the Chargers honestly got a pretty good deal on him. His market value was about, I think Arjun was like $0.25 million off in AAV in terms of what was projected, or $0.5 million off in AAV. He actually predicted a really close Trey Pipkins contract to what the final numbers ended up being. So overall, I think Trey Pipkins is a great signing. It was one that I think, if you're talking about this team contending and having the optimal offensive line that they needed to have, is something that they needed to get done. I don't think any of the combinations or permutations in which you bring Trey or move on from Trey Pipkins are better than the reality is, I guess, where you keep him. So overall, give Trey Pipkins an A-. Really solid contract for an improving player, and you gotta give credit to Pipkins. Morgan Fox. This one is interesting to talk about. I'll get to my fun fact in a second, but Morgan Fox got 2 years, $7.25 million. There was some, interesting discourse on Twitter when it came to Morgan Fox, who of course works with Coach Ed McGuire. Or this is not Coach Ed McGuire. Sorry, I'm talking just about Coach Ed. He, gets this 2 year, $7.25 million deal. At one point, it felt like Fox was probably, looking for more money on the open market. He gets $3.75 million guaranteed. This is a steal for the Chargers, and I kind of don't know how they got this to happen. Ultimately, Morgan Fox is the player last year, had 40 pressures, which was a career high for him. 6.5 sacks, second on the team to Khalil Mack. 21 run stops, was not a complete liability against the run when he had to play it, and had 5 quarterback hits, right? And he's 28 years old. It feels weird that this is what his market was. And I don't want to make the comparison, but Jerry Tillery somehow got more guaranteed money than Morgan Fox. Jerry Tillery got $5 million, I believe, in guarantees. Morgan Fox got $3.75 million. What the fuck are we doing? I have to ask this question. Like, I know draft pick bias is a thing, but Morgan Fox is so much better than Jerry Tillery that it's not even funny. Morgan Fox literally saved the Chargers season because he replaced Jerry Tillery. And somehow the Raiders gave him a contract where he had this leverage of being a first round pick and having the upside that he got paid more than Morgan Fox. To me, that's ridiculous. Now, draft pick bias will always be a thing in contracts, right? We talk about this with, first round picks who are, renegotiating or negotiating their second contracts versus, someone like Morgan Fox, who is an undrafted free agent negotiating their next deal. But it feels ridiculous to me that Jerry Tillery somehow got more guaranteed money despite being a complete liability, and how he plays on the field. I just don't understand it for the life of me, how that guy got more guaranteed money than Morgan Fox. And honestly, aside from the Jerry Tillery thing, which is just kind of funny, how did Morgan Fox not get more offers? This was a completely dead free agent class off the boards, right? This is something that Albert Breer and other people talked about. Really from the combine, it seemed like this was a down free agent market across the league based on, people in the league who were talking to reporters, and not as much money was spent as it was last year, and not as much money was spent in this free agency period as is going to be spent next year when the cap jumps, right? So this is sort of that weird in-between year where teams were sort of figuring out where to spend money, right? And I think this was a free agency that they sort of just didn't want a part of as much. And so ultimately, Morgan Fox kind of ends up having to settle for the deal that he got. Maybe got a little bit more to play in some other places, but takes a little bit smaller of a deal, I guess, to remain with the Chargers. So I feel bad for Fox because I do think he deserved a much better contract personally than he got. But ultimately, gets to stay with the Chargers. And from the Chargers standpoint of things, with Tom Telesco and McGuire, this is a grade A deal. You're getting really solid pass rush production from your interior, and essentially get to have that for the next 2 years for pennies on the dollar. So overall, really great deal for the Chargers, and excited to see what Morgan Fox does in the next couple of years here. And I don't think he sets himself up for a big payday potentially at 30. But if he continues his current pace, it's hard to see the market completely ignoring him 2 years from now. Especially if he kind of improves in that span and improves on his sack and pressure numbers. But we'll see what happens. 2 more signings to talk about that we don't have full complete numbers on these, but the numbers are such that we don't really need full complete numbers on these in terms of yearly cap hits and such. Donald Parham got a 2-year, $2.65 million deal. He's 25 years old. He was injured in 11 games this year, 4, I believe, at the start of the season. And then I think he missed 8 or 9 at the middle point of the season when he went back on IR. Had 190 yards in 2021 and then 130 yards in 2022. This is an interesting one because Parham, I think, in the way that they envision him in a potential Kellen Moore offense, I think is really valuable. And how they can use him as a red zone threat, how they can potentially use him in the open field. Not that the guy is going to become Dalton Schultz or anything like that from Kellen Moore's time in Dallas, but I think you just can see the ways in which Kellen Moore can potentially utilize him in this offense, assuming, of course, Parham stays healthy, and that has been the issue with the Chargers the last couple of years in terms of Parham being here. But I think it was a dead free agent tight end market, which is why Parham talked to New England. Parham talked to Cleveland, as potential teams that would be interested in him, but ultimately circles back to the Chargers after they decided not to tender him. And I think he got pretty close to what the rights of refusal tender would have been in actually, no, he didn't get close to that because that would have been a 1-year, $2 million deal. So he gets 2 years, $2.65 million. About 1.3 million AAV total. We don't know the cap hits, but like I said, for a contract that is that small, you don't really need to know it. So overall, this is an A- from the Chargers for me. As long as Parham can stay on the field, and let's say he posts like a 300, 400 yard season, assuming he's healthy in this Kellen Moore offense, it's an awesome fucking signing. Like it really is. And I'm excited to see Parham continue to remain a Charger. I know there are questions about health and stuff like that. But for me, ultimately, with Donald Parham, the sky is kind of the limit, right, in terms of what we've seen from him as a player. And if it doesn't work out, really no harm, no foul, right? If he is injured or misses a lot of games, you're ultimately paying $1 million a year for him, right? So there's not much to really cry about in terms of like the contract production value aspect of things. So really very, very low risk, potentially high reward, which, I mean, got to kind of crank that up as a win for Tom Telesco, right? So I gave Donald Parham an A-. J.K. Scott was someone who was also re-signed 2 years, $4 million. I think I meant to put that he was 26 years old. I don't know why I put that he was 2 years old. My bad. He led the league in the fewest punt return yards, right? It was sort of the hang time king this year. The Chargers punt return defense under Ficken was really solid with both, how they sort of went about returning the ball and how J.K. Scott really left very little room for most punts to be returned. And sort of the point of the game was to fair catch, right? And so I think he gets rewarded pretty nicely here with the 2 year, $4 million deal. Chargers kind of stabilize their punter for the next couple of years. They have their long snapper in Josh Harris sort of stabilized as well. Curious to see what happens at kicker, right? Because Dustin Hopkins was not released in this free agency, and from people that Steven talks to, in the Chargers building. The Chargers want a Dustin Hopkins and J.K. Scott, Dustin Hopkins and Cameron Dicker competition. So we'll see what happens at that kicker spot. But for the time being, the Chargers do have J.K. Scott back in the fold on special teams, and I think it's a really solid signing. B+. Let's go to the next slide here. Okay, time to make you vomit. Here's this picture of Drue Tranquill that I found from Clutch Points. Overall, Drue Tranquill did leave in free agency, which is something we're going to talk about. As I put in the top, Storm Norton also left to the Saints. I don't know why he was like the Saints' #1 free agent priority to go get. Like, fuck, we got to drop everything. Storm Norton's available. But, Drue Tranquill leaving, I think, is a big thing here. Obviously, was a 4-year player with the Chargers from when he was drafted in 2019. And so it is weird to just not think of him as a Charger anymore and think of him as a Chief. I tend to think that, what this comes down to, I don't know what offer Drue Tranquill did or didn't receive from the team. I'm not a source in that sense. I don't know. But it felt like from a very early on part of free agency, the Chargers did value Eric Kendricks more than they valued Drue Tranquill. Maybe they circled back to him, maybe they didn't. But I think they wanted to go in a new direction at their starting Mike linebacker. And so even if you did have Drue Tranquill back, he kind of would have been the backup linebacker 2, linebacker 3, depending on how you want to define that. And overall, it just kind of sucks to see a player that the Chargers developed walk to the Chiefs, right? Like, that kind of stinks. And I think Steve Spagnuolo is going to do awesome things with Drue Tranquill, right? Now that he's kind of like a gadget linebacker 3 is probably not going to be on the field that much, right? You can kind of draw up some blitzes with him. You can, use him in pass coverage. You can use him a little bit more selectively than when Drue Tranquill was here and like had to play the run, for example, when like run defense isn't necessarily like the name of his game, right? And he's not necessarily like the world's best tackler, I would say, right? So Steve Spagnuolo with the Chiefs can kind of like accentuate the things that made Drue Tranquill really good here when he was at his best, and sort of take that up to the max with the Chiefs when, he sort of is behind, guys like Willie Gay and Nick Bolton, Leo Chenal, but I do think he'll find his role in Kansas City. And for the Chargers, I think it was just that, they wanted to go in a new direction at starter, and at that point, didn't really make sense to like bring him in as like a backup or make him an offer in that capacity. I think Drue Tranquill probably thought he would have a better market than he did based on the season he had. But again, this was a really down free agency across the board, as you see from some of the other contract values that I talked about with Eric Kendricks or even Morgan Fox. Really, you look at linebacker, defensive tackle, running back, safety. Chauncey Gardner-Johnson got $8 million from the Lions, which after the season he had is just crazy, in 6.5 only of which is guaranteed. So all across the board, this was a down free agency, and I think Drue Tranquill, unfortunately, was just kind of a victim of that. I am sad to not see him with the Chargers at this point anymore. But I think if the Chargers wanted to go in this direction with Eric Kendricks, it kind of made sense for both sides to move on, unfortunately. I do wish there was kind of a role for Drue Tranquill on this team. I wish in my optimal dream world that he was linebacker too, as opposed to Kenneth Murray. But I do think that this was kind of a move that both sides probably were projecting to happen after the Chargers went after Eric Kendricks very early on in free agency and kind of let the world know what was up in that capacity. But that's it for this video, guys. Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. What do you think about the Chargers free agency signings from week 1? What do you want to happen in week 2? What happens with the Austin Eckler trade? Yada, yada, yada. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. What would you grade some of these Chargers free agents? That is it for this episode of Bolt Breakdown. So just as some news stuff, I guess, Tyler and Steven will have you covered in week 2 of free agency here as the Chargers potentially negotiate a John Johnson deal and potentially, go in some other directions, and we'll see what happens. They will do a show Wednesday and have a couple videos throughout the week. And then mock draft 2.0 after the first 2 waves of free agency is next week. And I will be back for that mock draft in which we will definitely take a running back. whether that is round 1 or some other round. But for the Mock Draft 2.0 show, I will be back on the main live show next week. So stay tuned for that if you'd like to. But anyways, as always, bolt up.